Welcome to the Police Accountability Report on the Real News Network. As we've said before, this show is not just about reporting police misconduct. It's about holding the system that aids and abets police misconduct accountable. And that's an important goal, because what good is it calling out bad behavior of individual cops if we don't critique the underlying system that allows it? Which is why we delve into the instruments of power and inequity that gives cops free rein over our lives. And remember, I want you to know that if you have evidence of police misconduct, please email it to us privately at par@therealnews.com, and we might be able to investigate. And please like, share, and comment on our video. I do read your comments, and I really appreciate them. You can also message us at Police Accountability Report on Facebook or Instagram, or at Eyes on Police on Twitter, or of course you can message me directly at Tejas Baltimore on Twitter or Facebook. Okay, now that's out of the way, let's talk about the topic of this show, policing. As we've touched upon briefly before, there's a major contradiction in American policing, and it reveals quite a bit. Why do police make so many minor arrests for drugs or other nuisance crimes while major infractions go unsolved? Why, for example, did American police arrest over 600,000 people for possession of marijuana in a country moving towards legalization, while only 20% of residential burglaries are solved in any given year? How exactly does such an extravagant use of public resources contribute to public safety? These questions are easier to answer if you consider a facet of policing that often goes unexamined: how law enforcement picks winners and losers in this country, and how important policing is to fueling that divide by creating a narrative about us. To explain how this works, consider a recent book called Narrative Economics by Paul Schiller. Schiller, an economist, goes to elaborate lengths to make the case that one of the most important influences on our economy is not interest rates or fiscal stimulus, but stories. That is, the narratives we tell each other have more to do with how the economy performs than all the stats in the world. To prove his thesis, he cites a variety of so-called viral stories that he claims had a significant impact on the economy. For example, the infamous Laffer curve, the specious economic theory that giving more tax breaks to the wealthy would stimulate the economy for everyone. What Schiller argues is what made the idea so potent was a story, that the concept was sketched on the back of a cocktail napkin in a swank DC restaurant. He argues it gave the theory a mythic quality, which undercut any potential critique. And indeed, both Republicans and Democrats alike have used the Laffer curve to justify cutting taxes for the uber rich. And as a result, they both have presided over the growth of the most lopsided era of income inequality in the history of this country. But this idea of the power of the narrative can be applied to policing as well, because extreme income inequality cannot be maintained without some sort of justification that not only protects the 1%, but convinces the rest of us their unfettered greed is not actually greed at all, but the result of a fair system apportioning rewards to those who are the most deserving. And the purveyors of the narratology that provides this trenchant backstory of persistent injustice is policing. Think about it. What aspect of American society conjures more stories about us? Watch the nightly news and you'll see a continuum of mugshots. Or just take a small sample of American popular culture, which is infused with a veritable propaganda, shows populated with heroic cops pitted against a near endless supply of American criminals. Never mind that the evildoers depicted on shows like Cops and Live PD aren't Wall Street bankers or corrupt politicians, or U.S. war criminals who send troops into foreign countries to kill and for oil. No, usually the villains are poor, black and brown, or both. Stephen, can you give me some context on this point?
Yeah. One of the things that we talk about income inequality is creating this idea that we talked about before, blanket criminality, which is the idea that certain groups in society are presumably criminal. And the only way you can really justify the type of policing we see with SWAT teams, you know, with drug investigations, with the war on drugs itself, with raids in homes over, you know, small amounts of marijuana, or locking people up for years over small amounts of marijuana, is to achieve the notion of blanket criminality. And blanket criminality is the first component of what we would probably call moral disqualification, right? That by achieving blanket criminality of a class or a race, we can then morally disqualify them from participating in the benefits of this society. And if you think, you know, why and how this has evolved, think back to slavery. The justification for slavery was theology, right? Was what came from a moral perspective. So once you situate people in a moral sphere, saying they are not deserving, that's the brilliance of the criminal justice system, because it puts everything in a moral sphere, right and wrong. So the minute you label a community drug-ridden, right, crime-ridden. How many times have we read statements of probable cause of police where they abuse the rights of people? And the first line in the statement of probable cause was, I was in an area known for drugs,
Yes.
i.e. not deserving of civil rights, not deserving of economic inequality, not deserving of health care. And it's an entire narrative constructed on this basis of the moral equivalency that is generated by policing. And the reason there's 600,000 drug arrests in marijuana, which has nothing to do with public safety, is simply to achieve that goal of a blanket criminality of a community, which then morally disqualifies it from participating in the extravagant wealth of this country. So that's how those two kind of concepts interact.
So let's take those ideas and apply them to a case that came to us from one of our viewers. It's the tragic shooting of a young man that has had lasting consequences for the community. Take a look at the body cam footage of a Tempe, Arizona police officer, Joseph Hine. This video shows the series of events that led to the deadly shooting of 14-year-old Antonio Arc. Hine was called to this back alley after the report of a burglary. After making eye contact with Arc, a chase ensues. Hine claims he saw a gun, but he fires blindly into the alley, striking and killing Arc in the back. No weapon was found. However, an orange-tipped airsoft gun was discovered afterwards. No evidence tied Arc to the burglary, and no charges have yet been filed against Officer Hine. Stephen, how would you apply the concepts we talked about before to what we're seeing on the screen?
Well, let's think of put the decision of the officer in the proper context. What did he decide? He decided to administer a pretty much instant death sentence, right? When the officer fires his gun, he's saying, with all probability, I'm going to kill this person. And this person, for some reason, is deserving of dying in this situation for actions that they have taken. So this officer firing into an alley where he can't really even see the supposed perpetrator can only function in a society where there's presumption of moral disqualification, right? Where the person who is the object of this random shot, I think, to a certain extent, somehow does not have the equivalency of rights or the presumption of innocence or any of the other things that you think would be applied, especially to such a severe punishment, you know, to firing a bullet. And if you look at the video, you can see how the officer really couldn't see what he was doing. You could see how there was no confirmation that this young man had a gun or that he was all connected to the crime. But because we have this concept, this psychological concept that infiltrates the process of policing, he felt the fact that he pulled the trigger proves our thesis, I think, in many ways. Because you would think if this young man had the same rights and the same sense, you know, of humanity that you know one would presume when you make this sort of decision that the officer wouldn't have pulled the trigger, right? The only way the officer pulls the trigger in that kind of situation is when he is functioning in the system we're talking about.
So Officer Hine resigned May 20th while still under investigation, and now he's actually applying for disability retirement benefits, not naming what the disability is. Do you think he's going to receive these retirement benefits and pension, and do you think he's actually going to receive any discipline for his actions? Well,
there are two aspects of this. Number one, you can't convict police of crimes because you're putting them in the same situation. You're criminalizing them. You're putting the same sort of blanket criminality and the same moral disqualification that you put the people that are the focus of this, right? So it doesn't make any sense to convict cops, right? Because for the elite or the political elite that need police to operate in this function to classify people as undeserving, if you convict cops or you charge them, you're putting them in the same situation. You're making equivalency here, and you can't do that to policing because policing has to have the rhetorical power of morality on their side. So you're not going to charge him. That's why we see so many cases where like, how could they not charge this cop? He shoots someone in the back, or Eric Garner. You could go on, or Michael Brown. How could you not charge them? Because the problem is for this system to operate, police have to be kept separate. And if you start charging police in the way that you charge people in poor communities or black and brown communities, you no longer have a functional rhetorical device there to create this moral gap, right? So you can't do that. And number two, will he get his pay? I think you will, because that's the payoff. I mean, there has to be some sort of financial reward for being part of this system. And to keep the system operating the way it does, and to keep it so prejudicial, there has to be money involved. I mean, police pensions are the tool of this political rhetoric, because every officer knows waiting for him or her at the end of this is a huge pot of money not just like 100,000 or 10,000, but millions of dollars, because a lifetime benefit of $50,000 as an officer could accumulate to be $3 or $4 million by the time he dies. So yes, I do think he'll get the money.
So right now we're going to take a look at the video of the 15-year-old boy in a wheelchair, a quadruple amputee in Pima County, Arizona. As you take a look at this video, you're going to notice that his 16-year-old friend is recording the entire time. This young man, who is simply recording on his cell phone what's happening, is charged with a crime, and so is the young man in the wheelchair who's being assaulted by this Pima County deputy. Can you tell me whether or not you think that the officer involved in this assault is actually going to be facing any charges? And why would he think that that sort of behavior would be approved by his fellow officers? Why would he think that was okay to do?
Well, because again, we're talking about the presumption of criminality, right? And what makes this case so illustrative of that concept is the fact that this young man was missing limbs. You know, he was not a person who could in any way fight back, and yet still the police officer felt that he had to completely control him. And what it shows is the ultimate psychology of this kind of policing, which is total control of the bodies under your supervision. So as absurd as it seems that a police officer, a healthy, police officer in full control of his body would have to brutally arrest a young man who is handicapped like that, it actually makes sense because there can be no compromise in these situations. You cannot have blanket criminality and moral disqualification in any sort of you can't compromise. It doesn't work. It doesn't work to say, well, this young man has some humanity. This young man is disabled. This young man somehow deserves. It's like when we talked about the arrest of a 7-year-old here in Baltimore, when they arrested Gerard Mungo. He was 7 years old, and they arrested him for supposedly sitting on a dirt bike and criminalized him. The point was not that he was 7. The point was that he was 7. The point was saying there is no end to this continuum of blanket criminality, and there is no sort of mediation to this moral disqualification of a class or a race of people. We will take it to the most extreme. And that's what you're seeing in the case of the young man who, is completely handicapped. There cannot be any compromise. Police cannot compromise with these communities. Otherwise, you lose the whole presumption that the people in these communities are not deserving of rights or of any equality in our economic system. It has to be all or nothing.
Now, something I thought was really interesting is that the 16-year-old boy who was only standing there holding his cell phone was also charged with a crime. What kind of retaliation, for lack of a better word, have you seen against people who have made the choice to record police misconduct? What have you seen happen?
Well, we've seen a case we're covering on the show, the case of Nick Pettit, recording from his own property, from his own porch, doing nothing more than recording with his cell phone, and police brutally arrested him because he caught them on camera, slapping a suspect. But I've seen it all over the city. We see cell phones confiscated. We actually did a case of Officer Ethan Newberg, who arrested a guy who just said something as he was walking by during arrest and made one little comment, and the cop ran out and arrested him. We have that on body cam, which we can show now. It is part of that process, right? Because the narrative has to be owned by police. Police must own the narrative to tell this story. Any cracks in that narrative, and that story collapses. And so if a person is recording and a person is trying to in any way show, and they do this to the media too, they attack us as well when we report, it has to be answered with full and equal force. Like, you are not going to be able to record me. You are not going to be able to expose this. The story is ours to tell, and that's why this happens.
So here we have a perfect example of our thesis, blanket criminality and moral disqualification in action. How could an officer see a 15-year-old in a wheelchair and believe that force was needed and would be approved of by his fellow officers? What kind of society would justify the shooting of a 14-year-old boy solely on the premise that an officer thought he saw a gun? Why would a cop feel empowered to discharge a fatal bullet from dozens of yards away without concrete proof of a violent threat? Remember, the alleged crime was a burglary, not a shooting or an armed robbery, and the so-called suspect was a 14-year-old boy. How could this type of life or death decision occur with such ease, if not for a sense that an entire community was somehow unworthy? Could an officer really fire off a bullet with so little evidence of a threat without some sort of sense that the person on the other end was implicitly guilty? Could a shooting like this occur without the concept of blanket criminality? And if the officer made such a reckless decision, why wasn't he punished? In fact, far from suffering reprisal, the officer has applied for a lifetime disability pension, a payout worth millions of dollars, funded by the same people he more than likely arrested for petty crimes before he took someone's life. Wouldn't such financial generosity seem like an insult added to the injury of the people who will have to pay for it? Or does it seem like, in some sense, a bribe sanctioned by the elites, but ultimately financed by the people who can least afford it? A means to keep our so-called Praetorian Guard ensconced behind the walls of wealth and privilege, a sign of complicity between the purveyors of income inequality and their enforcers. I'd like to take a moment to say thank you to Nole D for her help and support. And of course, I want to thank investigative reporter Stephen Janis for his work and for joining me here today. And I want you watching to know that if you have evidence of police misconduct or brutality, please share it with us and we might be able to investigate. Please reach out. You can email us tips privately at par@therealnews.com and share your evidence of police misconduct. And of course, you can message me directly at Teas Baltimore on Twitter or Facebook. And please like, share, and comment. You know I do read your comments and appreciate them. My name is Taya Graham, and I want to thank you for joining me for the Police Accountability Report.